This is Bible teacher Nelson Walters, and today we're going to ask an incredibly important question. Is the Shroud of Turin the actual burial cloth of Jesus? Is that image on the shroud of Jesus, the one we've seen in all those iconic pictures, and even more incredibly, is the name of Jesus, Yeshua the Nazarene, burned into the actual image on the cloth? Is it part of the image? Not that some medieval monk added it to the image, but are the letters actually hidden on the image? How in the world could this have happened, and why did it happen? As we enter Holy Week, we're going to examine this highly debated cloth and show you some of the incredible evidence that it is the actual burial cloth of the Lord, that the image captured the literal moment of his resurrection, and that the wounds we see that this man received, horrible wounds, are all part of the passion of Jesus. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us. 1 John 3:16. So we invite you to put your fingers in the nail holes and in Jesus' side as he instructed Thomas in the upper room. The only way we can do that today is to carefully examine the shroud. So if you think examining it isn't biblical, it certainly is. Jesus expects us to examine his body, and his body is imaged on this cloth, so it is our obligation to examine it. And I'm sure some of you doubt that this is the real burial cloth for a lot of reasons, that it's the same one spoken of in the Gospel of John. Peter therefore went out, and the other disciple, and that's John himself, and were going to the tomb. So they both ran together, and the other disciple outran Peter and came to the tomb first. I love how John puts this little detail, this little moment of pride, that he outran Peter to get there. And he, stooping down and looking in, saw the linen cloths lying there. Yet he did not go in. Then Simon Peter came, following him, and went into the tomb. And he saw the linen cloths lying there, that's the burial shroud, and the handkerchief that had been around his head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded together in a place by itself. And the other disciple, who came to the tomb first, went in also, and he saw and believed. John 20:4-8, a wonderful first-person account. But why did John mention the burial cloth and the handkerchief? They seem like incidental details, but John mentions them twice, and they seem to be the source of his belief in the resurrection. Before we look at the evidence for the shroud itself and the handkerchief, which was known as the Oviedo, let's look at this passage. John is recounting the most important moment in his faith journey, the moment he sees the empty tomb and the moment he believes. And he mentions the burial cloth, and he mentions it twice. Was there something about that burial shroud that caused him to believe? We have to assume from the way the text is written that there was, because he saw the tomb was empty from the outside and didn't believe then. It wasn't until he was inside the tomb. Was it an important fact for his first century readers? Again, we have to believe it was because he mentioned it. What was that fact? Was there something supernatural about that burial cloth that led John to believe, and possibly to have taken the cloth home with him? Although that's not mentioned in the account, it's a possibility. Someone obviously ended up with it. Evidence on the shroud indicates that it traveled around from place to place, so it is likely that a lot of people had seen it. John's readers also likely knew about the shroud, and perhaps it was a source of faith for them too. Was that supernatural aspect of the cloth, that the image that we can still see today that has been burned on the cloth was visible to John? That would make anyone believe, especially since John knew what Jesus looked like and could identify him from that image. That is our working theory. Now, the main reason that people doubt the shroud is real is a radiocarbon dating test done back in the 1980s. This study claimed the cloth they tested was from the Middle Ages. So these atheists, doing their study, indicated that it was their opinion that the image on the cloth was a forgery. The key to understanding this is the part of the cloth that they tested. You see, not all the cloth on the shroud is original. There was a fire back in the Middle Ages that damaged the shroud, and a replacement piece of cloth was sewn into the burned areas. And guess what part the atheists tested? That's right, the replacement part. So, the radiocarbon testing were done on the original cloth. It was redone. And guess what it showed? That's right, that the cloth was much older than the original study, probably from the 1st century. But that second test is never mentioned by the media, who stress the original test. But that's because it doesn't fit their belief that it's a forgery. And there is an even more accurate age-determining test called wide-angle X-ray scattering. And this even more reliable test places the date of the shroud to the 1st century, the time of Jesus. Tests on the fabric itself and how it was woven show the techniques and sewing stitches only were used in the 1st century. It's definitely a 1st century cloth. But where did the image come from? What makes the shroud unique is that image. Tests have shown the image is not paint or ink or dyes or marking of any kind. Tests also showed the surface of the fibers themselves have been colored with no penetration of dye into the fibers. Blood on the fabric did penetrate, but not that coloration. Scientists frankly don't know how this was done. They assume it was with a powerful light or radiation. If it was an energy burst of some kind that formed the image, it came from the body. It did not shine on the body. And they estimate that the electricity needed to form this type of image of this size would exceed all the electric power in the world that we currently use at this moment. It's way beyond our technology. Second thing about the image that makes it unique is that it contains three-dimensional information, kind of like a hologram. The darker the image, the closer that part of the body of the man was to the cloth. In fact, this 3D component is so accurate, they were able to make a model of the man in the image from it. Fourth, the image is a negative, like a photographic negative. To really see the image, you need to reverse it. This is how they know the energy came from the body. The shroud was the film of sorts, and the light fell on the fibers, making a negative. Fifth, the image is of both the front and back of the body and the outside, and in some places, the inside showing the bones. This implies at the moment the image was made, the shroud passed through the body, much as Jesus was later able to pass through solid doors. The body that was in that image was in the process of transforming. And finally, the image is moving, just as if you had exposed a moving object under a strobe light. The hands, feet, and chest have multiple exposures of that same parts as those parts of the man moved, as he took his first breath. Even though the experts admit the man in the image was dead from crucifixion, the body was moving, possibly, as we said, at the moment of his resurrection. If this is Jesus' image, it likely has captured that very moment. So we have an image that scientists don't know how it was made and can't reproduce it today, given all our technological expertise. Yet, if you ask atheists today how the shroud was made, they'll tell you it was a medieval forgery of some sort. In fact, do yourself a favor. Do a web search of the age of the shroud or how it was made, and the vast number of results will quote the disproven radiocarbon dating and those that call it a forgery. It's just simply deception in social media. Scientists have shown the image did not penetrate the fibers, but as we said before, the blood did. And they were able to test this blood. It was AB positive, a very rare blood type, yet this type is common among Hebrews. It contained a Y chromosome, So it was the blood of a man, likely a Jewish man. The blood also has a large amount of a chemical known as bilirubin. This is why the blood on the shroud remained red and didn't turn brown like most blood does. It's a chemical that is created when the body is damaged. And that's why, given all the wounds this man suffered, the bilirubin was incredibly elevated. The man in the shroud was tortured. Pollen found on the material of the shroud has been shown to come from plants, primarily from the area around Jerusalem, and some that only bloom in March or April. Granite granules found on the shroud also are indicative of the Jerusalem area. Those two things narrow the place to Israel and the time to around Passover, which is when Jesus died. One of these plants may have been used in the crown of thorns. The Gandalia flower has long thorns and fruit, and the imprint of this plant is found near the forehead and wrapped about the head of the man in the shroud. This is a particular torture that they used for Jesus. So then Pilate took Jesus and scourged him, and the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns and put it on his head. And they put on him a purple robe, and then they said, "Hail the King of the Jews," and they struck him with their hands. John 19, 1-3. The granite is most prominent on the nose and the knees, indicative that the man in the shroud may have fallen. His nose is displaced to one side, indicating it may have been broken in the fall or maybe in the beatings that took place prior to his crucifixion. Then they compelled a certain man, Simon the Cyrenian, the father of Alexander and Rufus, as he was coming out of the country and passing by, to bear his cross. Mark 15:21. Why did Simon bear the cross? Probably because Jesus had fallen and no longer could. When we examine the wounds on the shroud from the nails, we say they were driven through the wrists, not the palms as we usually see in medieval art. The bony wrists allowed the victim to better bear the body's weight, and the nails themselves were square, not round. Interestingly, there are artifacts remaining in Italy said to be Jesus' nails. Whether they are or not, we don't know, but they are 1 centimeter square nails, just like the marks on the shroud. Same size, same shape. The feet were pierced with nails as well, even though this wasn't the Roman custom at the time, but it did fulfill prophecy. One nail was driven through the ankle of the right foot. The left foot was placed on top of the right then, and a single second nail was driven through both feet. Right foot had 2 nails, left foot 1 nail. This allowed the left foot to rotate so the victim could lift himself to breathe. This technique was completely unknown until the shroud was studied. The nails in the wrists and ankles would have been driven right through a number of nerves, causing incredible pain. The disciple Thomas testifies that these nails were used. The other disciples therefore said to him, "We have seen the Lord." So he said to them, "Unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." John 20:25. And Psalm 22 testified about these 1,000 years earlier. "For dogs have surrounded me. The congregation of the wicked has enclosed me. They pierced my hands and my feet." Psalm 22:16. So to make that prophecy happen, the Romans had to put those nails in his feet. The man on the shroud has a 2-inch elliptical wound on the side, the same as would be made by a Roman spear. And on the back of the image are stains of both blood and clear serum, the kind of thing that happens after death when blood cells settle. But one of his soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And again, another scripture says, "They shall look upon him whom they pierced." John 19:34 and 37. So the shroud contains details like this that would be impossible to forge. And then there are those written letters of Jesus' name, the ones we talked about at the beginning. On the neck of the man in the shroud is a very unusual rectangle. Scientists could tell something was on this rectangle, but couldn't tell what. Then they took the official photograph of the shroud, and it was placed into a computerized visualization program. And when it was run, letters appeared in Latin and Greek saying Jesus the Nazarene. Now, how in the world did a sign like this, those letters, get there? The exactor mortis was the senior Roman soldier responsible for managing the torture and execution and in charge of confirming the death. This was likely the centurion mentioned in the Gospels. Once death was confirmed, he would write the man's name on a piece of cloth and glue it to the body. This is much like tagging a body in today's world. But Jesus' body was so damaged that the exactor mortis probably had nowhere to glue it other than the neck, where the glue would stick. Again, this is a feature that absolutely no forgery could copy. The letters required a computerized program to be visible. So when the centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake and the things that happened, they feared greatly, saying, "Truly, this was the Son of God." Matthew 27:54. So what are you going to do with all this evidence? The man in the shroud was dead, based on the blood and water, yet was moving at the moment the image was made. This can only be one man in history, the man who loved you more than life. This is how we know what love is. Jesus Christ laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers and sisters. 1 John 3:16. And there is our instruction as well, to lay down our very lives for our brothers and sisters in Christ. When those who wonder how we should be preparing for the last days, how did Jesus prepare for his last day? When the days drew near for him to be taken up, he set his face to go to Jerusalem. Luke 9:51. In the same way, John tells us to prepare to sacrifice ourselves for our fellow believers. It isn't about escape. It's about loving those around us and doing whatever we have to help them. That is why Last Days Overcomers are doing what we're doing. Down in the description is a link to our website. If you haven't downloaded our free ebook, you can do it there. If you haven't subscribed to our weekly newsletter, you can do it there. And if you haven't gotten a ticket yet to our conferences in Ohio, Arkansas, and Minnesota, by all means, get one and come out and see us. Now, on the shroud, in addition to Jesus' wounds, were many other objects. Many that were unexpected, like a belt, teflon, chains, longer hair, etc. Click right here to keep watching, because these things speak of a Jesus slightly different than the one you expect. Till then, this is Nelson, and I'll see you there.